Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining another SDEC session. I'm really excited about this session because, as all of you know, the world of data collection and browsers and cookies are changing very rapidly. So I'm excited to hear about this topic from Cory. So before we jump in to the content, just a couple housekeeping items. Cory, I'll let you forward for me. For those of you who are new to the search discovery education community, this is a free education forum around digital analytics, and we cover 12 different topics. We've generally had topics around Adobe Analytics, Google Analytics. I believe this is, I think, our first actual one around data engineering. So I'm excited about that. And Cory, your notifications, you might want to turn those off. But if you are listening to this, either through a recording or live, and you are not a member of the SDEC, you can join for free. And I'm going to be putting a link in the chat of the Zoom for joining the SDEC. And again, there's no marketing, no sales. It's just free education. And we'd love to have you as a member. So far, we recently broke the 3,000 member mark, which is cool. We're at over 3,100 members. We're in 80 countries and 865 cities. We definitely need to get more of a presence in South America, Australia, Asia, and Africa. But right now, we're dominant in the US and Europe. So if you know folks in those other regions that would benefit from this education, even though some of the sessions aren't on their time zone, we do record every session, so they'll be able to watch anything on demand. One thing I did want to point out, we have a Slack group where we post all of the recordings and we communicate about things going on in the SDEC. For some reason, we only have 67% of you in this Slack group, which is a shame, because if you're not in the Slack group, then if you can't attend one of these sessions live, then you can't see any of the recordings. So I would beg and plead for you to join the SDEC Slack group. We have over 30 recordings in there. Plus, you can communicate with all the 3,000 people through DMs in the Slack group, and we even have a job channel. So if you're looking for a job, or if you have a job that you're looking to fill at your company, you can post there. So if you're listening to this and you are not yet in the Slack group, or you're not sure if you're in the Slack group, please send me an email at sdec@searchdiscovery.com, and it takes about 2 seconds for you to be added to the Slack group, and I promise you it will be worth your while. So please join. I'm trying to get as many people, especially as email gets a little tricky with this many folks. Okay, and then last thing before I hand it off to Cory, during today's webinar, if you have questions around the technology, or you can't hear, or something's wrong, if you go to the chat area, you can talk to me and I'll be moderating the chat. I'll do the best I can to help out. But if you have a question related to the content for Cory, please don't put it in the chat. Please put it in the Q&A area in the Zoom. In the bottom of the Zoom, you should see a little thing that says Q&A. Please post it there, because that's the best way for us to see the questions that you have. And as always, this webinar will be recorded. So if you miss something, or if you want to go back and watch it later again, or share it with someone, there will be a recording in the Slack group. So that's enough for me. I will be monitoring the chat. If you have any questions for me, I'm going to hand it off to Cory. So Cory, thanks for joining, and take it away.
Thank you, Adam. And so thank you everyone for attending the session today. Things that have changed in data collection in 2020. So let's get into it. In today's session, I'd like to cover kind of what we've seen to date, what that impact might be upon you or your business, what we are potentially going to see coming up, the next steps that you could potentially take to address some of these issues, and I'll leave you with some resources. This deck will be made available on the Slack channel following the presentation. So 2020 in review. Privacy laws are definitely coming to the forefront. In 2018, GDPR was passed, and so was CCPA. GDPR got implemented for enforcement last year. This year saw the CCPA implemented on January 1st. It became effective. Became enforceable on July 1st. However, over the summer, one of the high courts of Europe ruled that the privacy shield framework between the EU, the America, and Switzerland was non-GDPR compliant. And so if you are one of those people that pull data out of the EU and you want to send that to America, you now need to be explicit with your users and say that you are sending their personal data to a country with less data protection than the GDPR, and they have to explicitly consent to that. But also, for those who just finished their CCPA compliance exercise, you get to repeat that process because on November 3rd, California approved Prop 24, which will bring the CCPA closer to GDPR by the year 2023. So definitely a lot of stuff happening on the regulatory front. We also saw work for privacy restrictions in Japan and Brazil, and I expect this to continue going forward. This is now just how the operation of your business now needs to accommodate based off the jurisdictions that you may be operating in. But let's switch to the technical things, because even if you follow all of the laws and you implement a consent manager, does that mean that you get the data? And the answer to that is sadly no, because the browsers can overrule what the user says. So in their efforts to be more closely aligned with the privacy of the consumer, the different browsers have implemented a series of changes close over this year. And I'm not going to read these all off because we're going to dive into a couple of these in the upcoming slides. But the cadence is extreme, and the pandemic did not slow that down much. So we have seen a number of changes go into effect in all of these different browsers that you may have the pleasure of working with. All agree that something needs to be done, but they disagree on exactly how they want to pursue about doing that. So we end up with a very divergent ecosystem where the browsers each go in their own unique direction in a lot of cases. And so different segments of your traffic may be affected differently. We'll start off looking at Edge because in January, you may not be aware, but Microsoft Edge, the default browser for Windows, changed their rendering engine, so the back end to the browser, and they aligned with Chromium. They then spent several months ripping all of Google's telemetry tech out of it, but added anti-tracking technology by default, which means for any user that is using Edge and comes to your website, the analytics will probably work. Any of your marketing analytics probably won't. Because what Edge does is it blocks access to storage, so local storage, cookies, and other technology, unless the user has developed an invisible score with your site based off engagement, known as the site engagement score. They have to reach a threshold of at least 4.1. Again, the site cannot see that, but once the user has interacted with your site enough to reach that score, your marketing analytics will start to work, but it is a decaying score. So if they stop using your site for a period of time and drop back below that threshold, it will stop working again. Then that was available for anyone who wanted to manually upgrade it, but then later over the summer, they force upgraded all people using Windows who adopted that Windows patching to the most current version. So selective, then mass rollout. And then since then, they've announced and started to deploy functionality. So people who are still using the legacy IE11, once they come to a site that has compliance issues with the new modern web standards, they're automatically upgraded to Edge. And so you shift from a browser that doesn't have anti-tracking protection to one that does. So as a result, analytics not as impacted, but marketing tech and campaign performance a little bit harder to do attribution under the new Edge design. Chrome has not done as much, but over the summer they rolled out what is known as same site cookie changes. And without getting too technical into it, it's a syntax change on how you set a cookie. But what that does is tell the browser under which scenarios cookies can be shared between websites. And that is a common thing for identity resolution and remarketing. So anybody who did not followed that news, even though it was announced in summer of 2019, their cookies stopped being communicated cross-domain. And as such, their remarketing program, identity resolution, or other services may not be working properly for Chrome. That rollout reached 100% in the later stages of August. So basically anyone on a current version of Chrome is having this behavior now. In August, they also modified the referrer behavior, so you're not getting the full path, but you're getting the top level domain name. Firefox, not to be left behind, did the following. They added support for those same site changes. They also began to block bounce tracking. So that is tracking that may be in effect for an advertising vendor by doing a series of redirects between the link that they click and the page that they ultimately arrive at. So they are taking special precautions under that scenario to be in line with what Safari is already doing. Now they have a series of privacy features known as enhanced tracking protection, and they modified that. So any tracker that sets a cookie as defined by disconnecting me's list will be purged daily after 24 hours under most circumstances. The special exemption here is if you interact with said vendor in a first party context, which means you actually go to the site that could actually be tracking you. They'll let that cookie stand for 45 days, but most people aren't going to go to doubleclick.net, for example, and so that could be purged after 24 hours. But let's talk about Safari's thing, intelligent tracking prevention, which is their series of privacy protocols that was introduced several years ago. But how has that changed? Well, in September, we saw the release of iOS 14 and iPadOS 14. And underneath the hood, they moved the intelligent tracking prevention from Safari specifically to an operating system level. And what that means is based off how iOS works, every browser on iOS 14 now has intelligent tracking prevention, which artificially limits first-party cookie duration set by JavaScript, blocks third-party cookies, and a whole number of other features. Also, new this year, people who have adopted iOS 14, it will now apply to hybrid apps. So if your app swaps between a native built-in feature or functionality and then a web view out to your website for things like checkout conversion, you're going to have to deal with the fact that that cookie will not last on that site for the length of time that it may have previously. And this applies to all web views, be it e-commerce or Facebook or Twitter or what have you. Then new this month, with the release of iOS 14.2 and macOS Big Sur, they have deployed mechanics to combat CNAME cloaking, which I will discuss in a second. But essentially how this plays out is the following. For client-side first-party cookies and non-cookie data, such as local storage, you will see those pieces of data be systematically purged without any interaction from the user after 7 days. If the user arrives from a domain that the device has classified as having cross-site tracking capability, and there's name value pairs in the URL, then that might be reduced to 24 hours. And that is a common scenario from social networks and paid media. Additionally, as I mentioned previously, restrictions on the data collection are affecting desktop Safari, but also all browsers on iOS 14 and iPad going forward. So data collection on Apple's platforms gonna get a little bit more dicey, a little bit trickier, or impossible, depending on your use case. And your look-back windows are going to be significantly shortened under various use cases. CNAME cloaking is a technology that's, CNAME stands for Canonical Name Record of the domain name system. And you can see that in this example on this slide, supportwackadoodle.com actually goes to wackadoodle.zendesk.com, but from the browser's perspective, it can only call support. So it looks like it's a first-party connection. But what they're doing here is if Zendesk was to set a cookie, because Zendesk is not Wackadoodle, now iPad, iOS, and Big Sur can identify that and will limit the cookie set by Zendesk to 7-day max duration. So previously, you would see analytics and marketing vendors say, hey, deploy CNAME records to point to our endpoint. It looks like first party. It gets around the ad blockers. You get the long cookie duration. It bypasses intelligent tracking prevention. That is no longer going to be the case going forward. You are now limited to 7 days. So if that is important to you, and it probably is, you might want to speak with said vendors, see if they have any other solutions. Not to be left behind, however, Apple has announced plans for their App Store. Beginning on December 8th, you will need to, upon app submission or updating, be required to state all of your data collection practices and with whom you share that data. And that will appear on your app download page. That is a required condition for submission. Then in early 2021, they will require you to actually prompt for consent prior to reading the IDFA or pulling certain kinds of data off the device. And you have to use the system dialog for that to happen. I don't currently have a date on that, but there has been extreme cause for concern about this. Facebook has actually announced that if this goes in, they're going to have to see, but they strongly suspect that it's going to adversely affect their analytics to the point that the audience network for targeting on iOS may no longer be feasible to support. And so we could see Facebook phase that out. But let's talk about the impact that this could potentially be having. Here is an example of why charts can be misleading. So if we look at this is StatCounter data. We pulled all of the market share for tablets in the US, and we're looking at Safari. And so if we look at September of 2019, it's at nearly 75% market share. And if we look at October of 2020, it has dropped to just over 50. We have seen increases in Chrome and Android, but not enough to offset that. So what is the problem here? Well, it could look like your website has an issue with Safari, and then you have your developers spend a lot of time trying to identify that. It could look like Safari, like people are giving up their iPads and adopting Android, probably, but no, that's not what's happening here. And it could look like people are you're seeing a contraction of the market, but that's also not what's happening. What actually happened under this slide is last year with the release of iOS 13, Apple updated the user agent string, which is used by analytic vendors to basically say, I am not an iPad, I am a Mac desktop computer. So how I've seen this play out in different data sets is you'll see potentially high double-digit percentage declines in your iPad traffic as people adopt iOS 13 or higher. And you will see likewise increases to Mac OS traffic. But from just the chart, without that context, you would think something is probably wrong with your website or some other large market condition. But there is just as much iPad traffic as there ever has. It's just that you can't pull that out from looking at it the way you used to do that. And so that is a minor change that could potentially impact things like your device reporting or how you would go about QAing a website. But what does that look like when we're not talking about stuff like market share? The impact to the business can actually be fairly substantial, depending on the exact browser mix that you have and how you do your marketing and how that marketing is integrated. You could see things like ad spend inaccuracy. So you don't know what your true ROI is. What that might actually be is your paid media channels look lower than they actually are, but direct is stealing credit. So if you're doing any sort of conversion attribution models, those might not be as accurate as you might hope. Likewise, because direct is stealing credit, you might not get proper performance data for campaign and content management. So you could think that your campaigns are underperforming, than they really are. And then if you happen to make the mistake of adjusting your spend without fully understanding what's going on here, that actually could become real loss, because what is happening is they're seeing the ad, they're arriving on the site, but the ad isn't getting credit for doing the driving. But if you don't run the ad, then do they even get to the site? And then you've actually lost money. So that is something to consider when figuring out your marketing plan. On the personalization and optimization front, it becomes more difficult. If you can't say that the user that arrived last Tuesday is the same user that arrived on the following Wednesday, then you might have a hard time trying to personalize their experience. And how this actually could play out for an optimization platform is the person would get entered into the experiment multiple times. That's not ideal because it makes it look like there are more unique users in your experiment than there actually are. You hit your significance level faster, but is that truly a representative sample? It is hard to say. But on each time they get entered into the experiment, there's the potential that they get served an alternative experience, which violates probably your experiment controls. Things to be aware of. And that is a common scenario with client-side A/B testing platforms, unless you have taken special precautions to prevent that from occurring. Additionally, we're seeing things with audience segmentation. So for example, I have this audience. It is fairly large. I know this because I am getting a bunch of unique identifiers. There is an increased probability that those audiences are not reachable, or large segments of those audiences are not reachable, because you're seeing a ID explosion, but you're not actually finding that you can retarget or address those people because the ID has only been used for that one period of time. So depending on your time boxes, your customer journey mapping could be limited, but your audience segmentation could be impacted. Then on the technical front, we talked about the refer data being trimmed, but third-party data could actually be ceased to be collected because the browsers are blocking transmission of that data to those third parties. So if you're buying data from those third parties, that might not be of the highest quality, but technical functionality that's based or built around some of this technology might cease working entirely, because the underlying assumptions that the technology was built around have changed. So it's not that the technology had been built incorrectly, but it's similar to people who built along a beach and now they're dealing with climate change. It's not their fault that the climate is changing, but it is just a technical reality of the water level is getting higher, and so they now need to make additional changes. The adoption rate for iOS 14 that is spurring a lot of this is extremely quick. It has already exceeded 40% adoption. It is on track to it's well on its way to rival iOS 13 adoption, which had 90% adoption prior to iOS 14's launch. So this is going to continue to increase as people upgrade their phones and such going into Christmas, and it's going to definitively play into the marketing analytics that you may be looking at when doing year-over-year comparisons between 2019 and 2020. So a lot more context, a lot of other things that you may not see or may not be aware of will manifest in your reporting. And it might be hard to explain some of that without all of this knowledge. But what's at stake? If we bring we look at the market segment share for the major browsers, roughly 43% of web traffic in the USA is affected by browser privacy features by default. It's a fairly large margin. So if nearly half your web traffic, but potentially more for your specific business, is impacted, you should really be aware of that and understand its impact for how you do your reporting. So if we go back to the consent management scenario, I said you could set a third-party cookie. Safari says, I don't accept the third-party cookie. It doesn't matter what the consent manager was told, you still don't get that information. So the two systems are working separately. Now, because all this is enabled by default, what if you wanted to disable it? It's actually relatively tricky. You cannot disable it from a site user perspective. The Customer can disable it, but they need to go into their settings and go down like 4 levels to find the appropriate setting to change. The chances of that users are going to actually do that, I think, is fairly slim. So this is just going to be the new operating environment for data collection going forward. But does it end there? Sadly, no. We are looking at more changes down the road. So, as I mentioned before, consent prompts will be required for data collection on iOS and iPad apps in early 2021. You are required to do that. Violation will have your app pulled from the store. Repeated violation will have your developer account terminated. So Apple is very serious about this. The app guidelines are very close to being in line with GDPR. So the difference here is that the entire app store is subjected to it. So if your business did not need to do with GDPR because you don't service Europe, you now need to basically go through that type of exercise, even if you're only US based, if you have an app on the App Store. Additionally, the CCPA becomes effective in 2023. So as the California Attorney General defines the new law, you will need to make changes to comply with it. One of the notable changes is it has special callouts for sharing of data, as well as it has a special callout for something it calls cross-contextual behavioral advertising. I tend to refer to that as remarketing. So there are different consent mechanics involved, and there are potentially different scenarios that you now need to consider that you did not before. Also with that law, California is standing up a new agency whose sole purpose is to investigate and fine and try companies that are not compliant. And the law is specific in that if you are willfully non-compliant, the fines will double. By the end of 2022, Google has announced plans to phase out third-party cookies entirely. Chrome has a very large market share that would break remarketing under a number of scenarios. It also breaks things like single sign-on. So in absence of new tech, I don't know what's going to happen, but we should expect that with Edge, Safari, and Firefox heavily restricting third-party cookies, this is an inevitability at some point, even if Google is not the one to do it. And so we need to be looking at what that means for us and our business. We're also going to see shifts for advertising with privacy. So you may be familiar with the IAB's Transmission and Transparency and Consent Framework 2.0 that different ad vendors have supported. You may not be aware, but the Belgian DPA has issued a viewpoint that that is non-compliant with GDPR. So it remains to be seen if the courts will ultimately agree with that. But that might quickly be on its way out, just as quickly as it came in. What Apple is proposing is SK Ad Network, which is a ad network that's designed with privacy in mind, so you don't get as much information, but you can still tell your advertising is working. So what we ultimately could end up seeing is a stark decline in targeted advertising and a much larger return to context-driven advertising. With that in mind, Google and Apple have released proposals for how they want to change ad attribution. So currently, under the normal scenarios, what we're seeing is on your thank you page, you have an advertising pixel that tells the double click or what have you that you have actually had a sale. What this would change is how that campaign gets measured. So you would not do that, but at some point, up to 48 hours later, the browser would say, I bought something, and that something was driven by this campaign. So depending on which of these proposals get adopted and what the general consensus is between the manufacturing and the manufacturer and the advertising industries, we could see large scale changes to how campaign performance is measured in 21 or 22. We also need to be aware, though, that a loss of data is extremely likely either by regulation or technical limitations. So the cross-site referrer changes, we lost the path. We do know that browsers such as Safari have refused to implement 16 different APIs because they have privacy concerns. We do know that Brave, as a browser, will lie to you if you attempt to fingerprint it by adding noise and modification of the values that you're trying to pull. So should just be aware that certain data will become off limits. And then as the consent mechanisms for iOS go into effect, polling has indicated that even if they are highly interactive with your brand, less than 20% of people will actually say that you can share this data with other parties. So it's going to be much more difficult to just pull data and have a very wide understanding of things. But what do you need to consider going forward? Currently, because all of the different browsers are doing something different, there's no one size fits all solution. Because what you do may or may not work. You might solve it for the browsers, but if you say you adopt a server-side tag manager, yeah, sure, that gets you out of the browsers modifying your request, but that doesn't mean that the vendors that you are integrating with support server-to-server communication. And so it is a jigsaw puzzle trying to come up with what covers the most use cases while still being viable and cost effective. The one thing I can say is most of the browsers are specifically trying to fight cross-site tracking and unintentional third-party tracking. So shifting to a first-party data set might allow you to retain some of that data quality that you have, despite the privacy changes. Obviously, having a stronger relationship with the user to where it's advantageous to the user to actually share the data with you is a stronger play than trying to purchase third-party data, which is going to be more subject and open you up to different legal liabilities. So that is something to consider. What you may not be aware of is that many of your vendors may have issued guidance on how to work around some of these changes or how to mitigate them or otherwise comply with them. Now, often that is not the out-of-the-box install. So you will have had to actually take steps, special steps to adjust for these factors. You may not have. So it's worth the conversation before you decide that you need to replace the platform in its entirety when all you needed to probably do was change a setting. Having those conversations up front allow you to know what relationships you can retain and what might be more difficult to make work under these new realities. One thing is for sure is the way that you build web apps have changed. So setting information on the browser with JavaScript is definitely on the way out. And that means that your servers now need to do more work. So you can do things like use reverse proxy servers, but a lot of the value is going to come from having the server actually set cookies and state as part of its response, which has a number of infrastructure implications relating to caching offsets and things like that. But for features to work, if they have to have any concept of time, such as a recommendation engine, they now need to be built a very specific way, or they will not work well between visits, essentially. If you're relying on a very short time span between visits, you need to have a super high retention rate and a super high engagement rate. If you don't have that, then you definitely need to modify how you're building your website. 2019 was a huge year for changes. 2020 is on track to eclipse it. We still have another 6 weeks to go, and we saw this changes in December of last year, so I can't rule that out. But what you need to do is have a process to regularly validate your data quality, both incrementally and between time periods. Because you ideally would want to identify if something has changed soon rather than when you're doing like end of year reporting. And if you're trying to do things like year over year reporting, reporting and comparisons, you now need to understand all of the ways that your data collection has changed without you having actually not done anything specific. So for resources, if this is confusing to you or you just want to have us take a look at it, Search Discovery offers a free assessment where we take a very high level view of your website based off a URL that you provide. If you are currently one of our customers, you can speak with your client service lead. Otherwise, you can self-register at Search Discovery. And within 2 weeks, we'll send you back a report and we'll offer to have a conversation with you about it. And you can decide if you want to engage with us or if that's important to you, or I just have an understanding of how that may be impacting your business. Additionally, I have a number of resources here that I will actually give this deck out in the Slack channel afterward. And you can follow these different people or read these different blogs or take part in these different discussion groups to stay up to date on this topic, or even engage with the community, such as the Browser Privacy Working Group. That is a GitHub repo that people from all different industries, from browser manufacturers and vendors to advertising agencies, et cetera, are having conversations on how the web needs to work in light of this new regulatory and privacy conscious environment. So with that, that is my presentation. And I, again, want to thank you for coming. And now we can get on to the Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Cory. And I'll have you just keep your contact info up as we go through the questions in case people want to connect with you on LinkedIn or email you questions. So if you have any other questions, please post them now. Even if we don't get to your questions, we'll see if Cory can answer them in written format, and we'll post those in the Slack group. So the first one is with regards to limitations like cookie expiration, ITP, ETP. There are discussions to move to fingerprinting. Do you have any opinions on that?
I do. Fingerprinting is not going to be ideal because you're still subject to things like regulatory compliance. And under the GDPR and CCPA, fingerprinting may be restricted underneath different jurisdictions. Additionally to fingerprinting, it should be understood that all the browsers have committed to fighting that. And so it is more liable to break suddenly without warning. So I think if you were to proceed into that, you should do so with the understanding that it may not work for very long, or that the browsers may ultimately adopt tech that misleads you.
Okay, so kind of along the same vein here, is moving to server-side tracking a possible way to go, for example, using the Web SDK from Adobe or the GTM server-side tagging?
It is, again, it's going to be subject to what vendors support the server-to-server communication. I expect that to increase in coming months, just because unrelated to the browser changes, you may or may not be aware that in May of 2021, Google will consider page performance a major search ranking. And so it would actually be beneficial for other reasons to move to a server-side tag management solution. Now, with that being said, it changes how your infrastructure and tracking has to work. So it's not a light lift. The other thing to be aware of is just because you're tracking on the server does not get you around your regulatory requirements. So for example, under GDPR, you still need to require consent even if the collection is not occurring on the browser.
Okay, so mentioning CCPA, does the move to make CCPA to be more like GDPR make it cover nonprofits as well?
In the draft of the law that I have reviewed, no, it does not presently say that you need to comply if it's a nonprofit. There are other restrictions. That does not mean that at some future point that will not be the case. You need to validate which of the scenarios you care about. And I would recommend following the draft proposals as they work through the AG and just make sure that nothing changes.
Okay, so this one is specific to an auto industry, but it's kind of hard to get first-party data from industries such as auto versus other industries like you might expect, like telco or banking. So their question is, what would you believe would be the solution for these cases, making login mandatory for people that just want to maybe check out cars or something that's not like a bank doesn't seem super feasible. So like, what's the solution there?
It's going to be rough. Um, and I fully acknowledge this. And Apple even goes into say for their app guidelines that you can't require a login just because. Like you have to have a compelling reason for it. So I think that that's going to be a challenge for certain industries that don't have super high engagement. So what does that look like? It's hard to say. It's probably definitely going to impact, I would think it's going to impact them much more significantly. So I don't have a good answer for you here, but what we might be on the verge of, and I'm not predicting this, but I think it's a possibility, is we could see a shift to a much less open web as a result.
Yeah, it seems like almost like Apple is going to basically say, here, sign in using your, your iPhone to this website, and then they'll deal with all that kind of security stuff behind the scenes. But I do think that almost every website is going to end up having to force people to log in at some point. It just seems like that's the only way to get around this. Um, so someone had a question, will the metrics for the total number of users or new users become useless due to the deletion of cookies after 7 days?
It depends on exactly how you're measuring that metric. So what's going to happen if your ID that you're using gets deleted is it's going to increment, you're going to have a higher new, quote, new user number and a lower retention number than you might otherwise have. So it affects things like cohort analysis. However, if you are populating the analytics platform with your own ID, which is more stable, then those numbers could be correct. So for example, you can set your own visitor ID for Google Analytics and for Adobe. They have like special formats you have to follow, but you can set those. And if you set them in a way that the browser doesn't systematically delete them, then those numbers are going to be more reliable than if you use the IDs that they figure out using JavaScript that are subject to that deletion.
Okay, so one last question. We'll end on a controversial one. Someone asked, what about Apple getting sued for not sharing the IDFA, but using it themselves?
That is an interesting thing in Europe. Now, I don't know how that's going to shake out because Apple doesn't use the IDFA. And I think that's a misconception. So, what Apple does is, based off my understanding, do the majority of things like recommendation engines on device. So, Apple, the company, doesn't know. Your iPhone knows, but it's not being shared with the company at large. So, if that is ultimately true, then can it be said that Apple is really using the ID? And I don't know. However, with that said, I do know that's what their terms say. So it's going to be an interesting court case, I feel. And I'm looking forward to see how that pans out.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Cory, thank you so much. There will be the slides and the recording of this webinar in the Slack group later today. So thanks everyone for joining. And Cory, thanks so much for all this super valuable information.
No worries. Thank you for having me.